All right, we are just a couple minutes here, or excuse me, we've 2 minutes after the hour. We're going to go ahead and get started today. I want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar, and especially for folks who may be joining us the first time. This webinar series is brought to you by a partnership between the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky and the Kentucky Brownfield Office. This partnership has been ongoing for about the last 2 to 3 years, and we work together really to increase our opportunities around education and outreach to communities and organizations and municipalities throughout the Commonwealth. And today's webinar, we're really going to be focusing on the EPA Brownfield grant. This has been a really busy week, or excuse me, a really busy month for this partnership. This is our second webinar of the month. And last week we held the 2-day boot camp in Frankfort, Kentucky, where we had approximately 20 attendees really join a fairly intensive 2-day training to learn all things brownfields. I will admit that part of this presentation is rooted in some of the material that we shared in that boot camp. But really the purpose of today is we're going to talk about the upcoming anticipated EPA Brownfield grants. We're going to talk about how they're scored and really try to better understand how to be best prepared for those opportunities when they emerge later this fall. Today with me, I've also have a colleague of mine at CEDIK, Tyler McDaniel, who works to support our environmental health and supporting communities addressing environmental concerns throughout the Commonwealth. We will be on after the presentation. So if there are any questions or comments, either about the materials or topics that Tyler may be able to respond to around the available technical assistance, we'll be here to address those. As a part of the webinar sort of structure, you may not see the chat function on your end, but I do encourage you to use the question and answer, the Q&A function. At the end of the webinar, we will circle back to any questions and try to address those as best as we can. If we can't address those specifically, we'll follow up with the state staff if they're particular to their purview. But with that said, I'd like to thank you all again for joining us. We have allotted 1 hour for this webinar. We may run a little short of that, so I'll give you back a couple minutes, hopefully, at the end of the webinar for the rest of your day. But let's go ahead and jump right into today's content. Again, we are talking about demystifying the EPA Brownfield grant, and I simply want to share what communities need to know about these upcoming opportunities. So as we sort of think about, brownfields and brownfield grants, I always like to start with, what is a brownfield? And let's start with a general definition. Brownfields are simply those properties or sites that are contaminated or potentially contaminated, and where the redevelopment or reutilization of those sites are complicated by the concerns of that prior or potential contamination. Both the EPA and the state of Kentucky have similar but slightly differing definitions of what a brownfield is. But really what I want to convey here is that brownfields are any of those property sites or additions to, for example, annexes, if you will, that where the redevelopment of them is complicated by the real or potential presence of contaminants. So when we think about who or what these sites may be in our communities, oftentimes, as I'm asking communities if they have brownfield sites, sometimes there's some confusion about what they are or what they could be. So this list provides really just a snapshot of many of the types of examples of these building sites or additions that we see. So for example, many vacant or blighted buildings, that's usually how we enter the conversation, because every community struggles to address blight or vacancy for those underutilized spaces. But also specific sites include industrial sites or factories that have long languished, former gas stations with those underground tanks, dry cleaners, old rail yards, schools and hospitals, vacant lots, where any of these may have may have existed. We also often see old church buildings included in this. Really, what I would invite you to think about are any building sites or structures that previously served a purpose in our communities that no longer serve that purpose or are vacant or abandoned or underutilized. Now, one thing to note here is that one of the most common contaminants that we encounter are asbestos and lead. And in particular, these elements in building construction were proper. They were sort of across the board accepted. And it wasn't until the 70s and early 80s that these products were phased out. So, in fact, many of these buildings that were built prior to those dates do, in fact, contain some sense or some semblance of contaminants within them simply because of the building materials and the practices of those days. So, I simply don't want to sort of convey the point that every brownfield building has a responsible party in terms of the person or entities responsible for that contamination. Sometimes, in particular with lead and asbestos, they were simply the adopted practices of construction at those times. But when we look at, what can they be? What can these brownfield sites be as both urban and rural communities attempt to redevelop them and bring them back into a productive reuse? These are two great examples. In Anvil, Kentucky, Lincoln Hall was a long languishing structure in Jackson County. And by leveraging and using the Cleaner Commonwealth Fund that I'll discuss a little bit later, they were able to transform this historic school really into a community center, and they have great plans to utilize this space. Another great example that many people throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky are familiar with is the Owensboro Riverfront. This site had many environmental concerns from its sort of industrial past. And over time, leveraging the brownfield assessment and cleanup funds, they've been able to really create a dynamic social space that caters both to residents and tourists, improves quality of life, and has been really a concentrated place of local businesses. Both great examples of the ways these brownfield projects have both addressed existing contamination, but also created dynamic community assets, improving the quality of life of local residents. Now, why are we sort of talking about EPA Brownfield funding right now? Well, one of the reasons is that the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law really infused a historic $1.5 billion into the EPA Brownfield grant over 5 years. Now, we only have one grant cycle left in that 5-year timeline to apply for these additional grants and higher amounts. One unique thing that occurred as a part of this bill funding is that not only were the numbers of grants increased, but the cap, the maximum amount allowable, was also increased. So right now we're seeing more and more funding available and more funding invested throughout the Commonwealth. And I've got a slide just a little bit later that will sort of highlight the success of Kentucky in both applying for and receiving these grants as a part of this funding package. Now, the other thing that this means is that as a part of this bipartisan infrastructure law and the increased funding, we were able to create this ongoing partnership between the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky and the State Brownfield Office. So not only have we been able to increase our education and outreach, helping communities become more competitive for these granting opportunities, but we've also been able to identify and support communities as they access direct technical assistance dollars through the state programming. Now, as we're talking about grants and granting, I'm going to infuse a couple slides throughout today's presentation that really focuses and touches on, what does it mean to be a competitive applicant? We do have some grant writing trainings upcoming. The date is to be determined. We're looking at some dates in May, and you all should receive notification of that as soon as we set the date, either through our monthly newsletter or through emails that I send out directly to attendees to these webinars. Now, speaking of that, as we think about, why do grants get funded in general, not just the EPA Brownfield grants, but in general? Why do these proposals get funded? Well, the first rule is that the applicant follows the directions. Every grant, whether it is from a private philanthropy or a government source, puts out a call, a notice of funding, or a request for proposals, and that request usually articulates some very specific instructions. Now, if you do not follow those instructions, specifically the way that they are intended or communicated, your grant will not be competitive and in many cases may not even be reviewed or scored. Now, secondly, after you've read the directions and follow those to a T, a good proposal includes a good story. So, is your narrative text and data, is it clear, concise, and compelling? Are you able to convey the need and the purpose of that grant? And we're going to talk a little bit about that in more detail as it relates to the EPA Brownfield grants. Now, of course, your grant needs to be well written. We offer grant review and grant training to support that endeavor. But lastly, I would invite you to understand the review criteria, the scoring rubric, if you will. And again, those are often found in the directions or the details of the funding partner or agency that you're seeking funds from. Now, as we think about sort of the availability of funds for brownfield projects, we have a number of funding opportunities through the EPA. Those are given out on an annual basis. My next slide will sort of go into the timing and the sequencing of that. They are incredibly competitive. It's one of the reasons that we hold these webinars and work directly with communities to increase that competitiveness and help communities better understand how to compose a clear, compelling, and concise proposal. Now, the state also has a fund, a cleanup fund. It's a revolving loan fund called the Cleaner Commonwealth Fund, and those are for cleanups. They offer funding. These are loans at 0% interest with a certain percentage that they can sort of waive upon completion of the cleanup. Now, right now, like I mentioned, there is more funding available than ever before as it relates to brownfield programs. And these funding mechanisms include all kinds of things that communities can do beyond assessment and cleanup. So you can do planning, you can do sort of multi-community, multi-dimensional, really assessments, cleanups, and many things that go beyond that I will share momentarily. Now, the other thing to note here is that there are additional federal dollars available for additional portions of your redevelopment plan. Now, the reason this is important is because we really are moving away from an environmental cleanup and mitigation program to thinking about the brownfield redevelopment process really as a process where it is a redevelopment tool to help support broader economic and community development. Now, as we think about the anticipated timeline, and this is informed by precedent set through years past and the cycles that have emerged. Typically, how this works is the solicitation goes out in September, so we are a number of months away from that timeline, but it's never too late to start preparing, and you'll sort of get a better sense of why that's the case. Now, once that proposal or request for proposals is made public, typically there is a roughly 60-day window that communities, organizations, and municipalities have to sort of compile and respond to that call and submit their applications. Through a review cycle, the decisions are often made in the early spring, with announcements typically happening around May. And those funds are made available in the summer. These projects typically vary between 3 to 5 years, and reporting is required in the ACRES program. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are a number of activities that are eligible through the Brownfield granting program. This is an example of a number of the things that have previously been allowable to do as a part of your assessment or cleanup or multi-purpose grants. So, for example, Brownfield area-wide planning. You can use monies to help pay for the identification of additional sites and to really strategize around cleanup options for those catalyst sites. And what I mean by catalyst sites are the sites that after the investment, cleanup, and redevelopment, can really instigate adjacent property redevelopment and investment. You can also use these funds to do site reuse assessment. So really doing a full evaluation of the opportunities or constraints around those sites. You can use it to investigate land use. So really looking at sort of land use incentives and opportunities that can help drive future redevelopment of brownfield sites. You can do market studies and pro formas really to determine the financial feasibility and the market demands around reuse strategies. And you can evaluate your existing infrastructure. One of the benefits of brownfield redevelopment is that these sites are often located where existing infrastructure is present. And there is a certain cost savings in not having to redevelop or sort of situate older infrastructure. Anytime we can reuse existing infrastructure, that is a dollar saved. So these funds can also be used to think about, the long-term strategy and availability of infrastructure or reuse scenarios and the infrastructure that they may require. Additionally, you can investigate disposition strategies, how those properties transfer and the environmental considerations associated with really complex sites. You can help determine reuse visions and strategies that help illustrate sort of the location and the proposed reuse. So you can start to think about the impacts on the communities and how those reuse strategies respond to direct community needs. You can also engage in resource road mapping that really outlines sort of strategies to leverage outside capital or stack capital, because what we know is that as we think about brownfield redevelopment and the use of brownfield funding, what we want is we want brownfield redevelopment really to expand from these catalyst sites. So we also know that our redevelopment strategies often include more than just that particular site. The brownfield money is fairly constrained in what it can do for those sites. So, for example, it will not remodel a building. It will not help install new sidewalks or sort of ADA accessible infrastructure. So those project components have to be funded by other elements. And we'll talk a little bit later about resource road mapping and leveraging those funds. Additionally, like I mentioned in the pro forma, you can do market viability to focus on sort of the outside interest for those brownfield sites. And lastly, redevelopment plans or revitalization plans. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the specific grant opportunities and kind of give you a snapshot of what they're available for. So probably one of the most popular is the cleanup. Often when we think about brownfields, we're thinking about getting to cleanup and redevelopment. So cleanup grants really provide those eligible entities, which are quasi-governmental institutions like area development districts or local municipalities, nonprofits, the ability to carry out really expensive cleanup activities on brownfield sites. Now, one caveat here is that the applicant must own the property. So the city must own it or the nonprofit must own it if they are requesting funding to clean that site up. So this is a great time. If you have historical sites that have gone through assessment, it would be a great time to revisit those sites and apply for cleanup funds. Now, there is sort of one caveat here in terms of brownfield cleanup grant recipients. If you have previously received cleanup grants for a property, unfortunately, you are not eligible to receive additional cleanup grant funding for that site. But one additional caveat to think, and this goes back to following the directions and being more informed than what we can go into in this particular webinar, is that some cleanup activities are subject to Davis-Bacon wage requirements. Now, one other piece here is the multi-purpose grant. So multi-purpose grants really are a combination of assessment and cleanup. So these provide funds to communities to carry out a range of activities. So planning or community engagement activities and all of those previous elements that I just shared. Now, with these, the target area may not include communities that are outside of sort of distinctly targeted areas. So, for example, these must be focused in neighborhoods or neighboring towns or a specific district corridor or a shared planning area. Again, for cleanups, the applicant must own one of the sites in the target area. Um, Excuse me, got a little wild with my fingers there and the slides. I apologize. Now, I want to give you a quick snapshot of some of the recent success that Kentucky has experienced with both assessment and cleanup grants. So, in the last funding cycle, there were a number of assessment grants awarded, and you can see those were $500 million each. So these went to the Big Sandy Area Development District, Carroll County, the City of Ashland, and Green River Area Development District. Again, illustrating that those quasi-governmental institutions like area development districts and municipalities are eligible for these. Now, these assessment grants covered a wide range of topics from sort of assessing and developing cleanup options for sites in the city of Paintsville, those in Carroll County, looking at waterfront sites in Ashland, and also developing regional assessments and cleanups within the Green River Area Development District footprint. The cleanup grants, as you can see by these numbers, are much higher amounts. In fact, throughout the bipartisan infrastructure law timeline, we have seen cleanup grants max out at $5 million each. In the previous cycle, that award amount, the maximum amount allowable was $4 million. And we saw some pretty high amounts come in here. So, for example, we have a $2 million grant that went to Frontier Housing for the Hayeswood Hospital project in Maysfield, where a long languishing and vacant property is being transitioned into housing. We also saw cleanup activities at a factory in Somerset, an annex building for the sort of local board of education in Caldwell County, and the city of Beattyville received a substantial grant to remediate a historic WPA building. If you'd like to learn more about that project in particular, we do have a webinar where we featured them as special guests to describe and sort of share the story, the long road to revitalization that they have been on, focused on that WPA building in their downtown. Now, again, there are supplemental funding mechanisms here. The Kentucky Department of Environmental Protection offers revolving loan funds. And additionally, the city of Louisville, Metro Jefferson County government has a supplemental revolving loan fund as well. Now, as we think about moving to that timeline later this fall, what should we expect? Well, typically what happens is on the EPA Brownfield site, you will see open solicitations. And if you go to that site currently, there are none because the grant cycle is not open at this point. They often will sort of list upcoming solicitations. So you can see that these upcoming solicitations are closed at the moment. But that grant, or excuse me, that website is really the place where they will make this public announcement. Again, that notice of funding opportunity, or NOFO, will come out from the EPA later this fall, and it will describe, these are the directions, if you will. An example overview is there on the right side of the slide, but it'll articulate, how you can use these grant funds, who can apply, what some of the threshold and ranking criteria are, and the points that are associated for each section, the due date and submission instructions. And as you go through this process, really make sure you fully understand the frequently asked questions and checklists. They provide some great insight and most certainly address questions that you may have yourself. Now, as we think about the ranking criteria and the Brownfield grant process, I mentioned the threshold. There is a sort of a preliminary threshold that all applicants must pass that is ranked by the EPA Region 4 office. Now, the ranking criteria are all point-based, so you know sort of how many points are attributed to each section, and each narrative section is ranked. So you can see these four major sections that are a part of the EPA Brownfield grants. They do differ slightly in terms of what is requested or required for the assessment, the cleanup, and the multi-purpose, but collectively they are fairly similar. So we'll sort of share and go through some of these ranking criteria, really to help demystify the scoring rubric, and where you may want to start thinking about in the types of questions that you will be required to address. Now, if we look at these four ranking criteria, we have the project area and your plan, the community need and engagement, your tasks, the cost and measuring progress, and lastly, your programmatic capability and past performance. Now, if we look at these top two sections, the project area, your defined area where you're going to be doing the work, your plan for reuse, articulating your community need, and the community engagement that has helped determine and prioritize the redevelopment plan, and identify your community need. If you do those two sections, which are often things that you can work on prior to the grant announcement, and frankly, I would encourage you to work on those prior to the grant announcement. If you can do that prep work, you've essentially accomplished about half of the grant application requirements. And what do I mean by revitalization ready or prep work for that process? The EPA has this wonderful guide called the Revitalization Ready Handbook. It's a guide to revitalizing land in your community. It really breaks down the process into some very specific components. It outlines those in sort of a chronological order, and additionally provides an Excel worksheet or workbook where you can document that progress along the way. You can see that the very first two major components are big sections. The orange and the gray section here in this illustration speak to understanding the needs and information. These are those two big components that I previously mentioned that are basically the prep work, right? What are the community needs and concerns? What are the environmental impacts or reuse strategies? So, as you work through sort of identifying community need, identifying that specific area of interest where you want to do assessment or cleanup, thinking about your reuse strategies and your community engagement, you've really accomplished and are able to address about half of your grant application questions. So again, there are four major components. I'm going to go through each of these and illustrate some of the scoring criteria. Now, one thing I should note here is that throughout each federal administration, the priorities of this program change and have changed. Each administration really is allowed to put their thumbprint or fingerprints on these grant applications and the scoring criteria. And we see it with each administration. We are in a unique situation where we have examples of the current administration in their previous administration. So we were able to look back at 2020 and pull some of the previously existing rubrics for these grant components to provide insight. Now, this is about as best as we can do to infer what to expect later this fall as we're able to reflect on how this administration has approached brownfield funding in the past. So let's start with our project area and plans for revitalization. You can see this section provides 40 points of the total, and they are broken into 15, 10, and 15 respectively for the target area, your revitalization of the target area, and your strategies for leveraging additional resources. So, as we look at this and get into the details here, you can see that, you're going to be required to discuss really the challenges within your proposed target area and the impacts that those brownfield sites have on your community. You're going to have to describe the reuse strategy or projected reuse. for those priority sites and how they align with the government's revitalization plans and the community's priorities. Okay. You're also going to be required to address sort of how you're going to leverage additional resources, right? What does your access to other monies look like? How are you going to leverage additional resources beyond the EPA investment to address environmental sites and spur additional redevelopment? So you're going to be asked to identify sort of key funding resources that you plan to leverage, and I'm going to show you some opportunities and places where you can find and identify those additional sources a little bit later. Now, one additional component here, the sort of second big piece that I shared previously is community need and community engagement. This is again 40 points, so the same amount of points as the previous section, broken in to two sections. You'll see 25 points allocated to community need and 15 points allocated to community engagement. Now, community need and community engagement are pretty self-explanatory. So this is simply asking you, how does this grant meet the needs of your community? And how will that target area and the redevelopment of that target area support that community and the specific needs within it? Additionally, your community engagement section is going to ask you to identify all of those partners and stakeholders that are going to be involved and discuss your plan to communicate and keep those stakeholders involved. Now, community need and community engagement are not novel or unique to the Brownfield grant. In fact, community need or a need statement are found in most grants. So you may see them as issue statements or problem statements. This really is your opportunity to focus on your community. And there are a number of examples of community needs that can directly relate to brownfields. So safety, education, health, quality of life, economic opportunity, and government efficiency. Now, I will invite you and highly recommend that you support these by facts and good data, and that your community need and your need statement really set the tone and underpin the purpose of your redevelopment strategy and the reason that you or your organization or community are applying for these grants. Now, as we think about community needs, I'm going to invite you to think about, asking yourself, are there current gaps between communities and the services that our community need? And I would ask that through your community engagement, that you gain perspectives on those that may be impacted. And as you think about both the community and the potential needs, there are a number of sort of categories that you should explore. For example, think about your social, your physical environment, your health, your economic, and your environmental concerns. Whether we're talking about isolation or apathy or crime related to these abandoned sites, or the health impacts to sensitive populations or disparities amongst your community, and the ultimate health outcomes or quality of life related to these sites in your community. Think about the physical environment, your infrastructure, your open space, recreation access, or the economic challenges faced in your community. The economic stressors, jobs, unemployment, poverty, local county budgets or municipal budgets. If your community has experienced sort of disinvestment that has attributed to vacancy or underutilized properties and sites. And certainly, as we think about environmental contaminants, the environmental considerations around air quality or proximity to contaminants, pollution, water quality should also be considered as a part of your community need or need statement. Now, a couple little tips here. Again, we do offer grant writing training that we will be scheduling in May, and we offer grant review to provide insights on your grant application free of charge. But just simply kind of a snapshot here around your needs statement. A strong statement is sort of understandable. It simply defines your need. It's compelling but rational. It demonstrates a hopeful urgency. You certainly don't want to suggest that your problems are so large and cumbersome that they will never be addressed. That will simply turn off the reviewers. You want to describe your target population and connect that to the needs or the operational sort of programs of your organization. And you also want to sort of underpin all of this with relevant data or evidence. A weak sort of need statement editorializes or makes assumptions, use antidotes as opposed to data. It focuses on your organizational need as opposed to the community need. Uh, I would also discourage you from simply listing facts and figures without any sort of text to accompany those to provide context. And do not include any irrelevant data that may confuse or distract the reviewer. Now, moving on, as we think about the last two components here of the Brownfield grant application, we have the tasks, cost, and measuring progress, followed by what I will cover in a moment, which is your programmatic capability and past performances. You can see this is 50 points. This is the largest scored section, with the previous two being 40 points each. You will see your descriptions of tasks and activities and the measurable outputs or outcomes representing 30 points, your cost estimates representing 15 points, and then those environmental results representing 5 points. So simply, you're going to have to describe what you're going to do, right? What's going to take place under this grant, and you're going to have to convey that you have a sound plan to execute what you say you're going to do. You're going to have to provide cost estimates for all of those tasks that are both realistic and reasonable. Now, lastly, your plan to measure environmental benefits is how are you going to track and evaluate progress to achieve these project outcomes, and that they have clearly correlated to the narrative that you have presented as a part of your application. Now, the last component here, programmatic capability and past performance. This is 35 points, really split between two pieces, your programmatic capability and past performance. So what we're talking about is what is the capacity of your organization, municipality, quasi-governmental entity to execute this grant. Right. So what's your capacity, your structure, your key staff? What are the systems in place to ensure that you can effectively implement and spend these monies in a way that is both efficient and follows directions? Lastly, you will have to share any information about your past performance because your past performance and ability to implement similar types of grants does provide insight around your ability to implement the grant that you will be applying for. So if, for example, you're going to be asked, have you ever applied for or received and implemented a Brownfield grant or other federal monies, sort of what meaningful accomplishments came out of that? Really sort of your opportunity to say you are willing, able, and ready to both receive and implement these dollars. Now, as we sort of move into the home stretch here in this webinar, I've got a number of slides sort of keyed up here that provide some broad insights around the grant and funding. These insights really come from my attendance and the state staff attendance at the most recent National Brownfield Conference and are pulled directly from both EPA representatives and other speakers and consultants who work on all of these sorts of programmatic pieces, both in grant applications, implementing, and providing technical assistance. So these are just a couple things to consider, and I have a number of slides that sort of outline and highlight some of the feedback that we heard at the national conference. So one critique we often heard was that, many communities are still writing grants without a project in mind, and that they draft these proposals at the last minute. The best practice that was suggested is to start thinking about these things a couple years in advance. Know what you are working towards and utilize that planning period, that planning time, really to focus on that early half of the proposal, right? Your community needs, your target area, your community engagement, and start to identify additional funding sources to implement your vision. And know that you have at least you have to be able to sort of articulate at least one reuse or one end use strategy from the very beginning in your application. You have to be able to say what you are going to do with that site beyond simply cleaning it up. Okay. Now, Successful brownfield revitalization is simply possible when communities see these brownfield sites as opportunities as opposed to liabilities, right? But the opportunities that we're talking about here are economic development, blight reduction, and broad community revitalization. So keep those three in mind as you're thinking about how you plan to leverage an EPA Brownfield grant. Now, you're gonna be asked really to think about all of the resources in those priority sites. So ensure that you have a connection between those sites and the important needs of your local residents. Okay. Now, one caveat here, like I mentioned before, that brownfield redevelopment and community redevelopment projects involve several stages. They often cost a lot of money, and that each phase is often funded by an additional entity or government funding source or philanthropic source. That brownfield grants do not provide sufficient funding for you to address all of the challenges that you may include in your grant application. That you're going to have to think about those additional resources that you're going to bring to the table to execute and implement your big vision beyond simply assessing or mitigating those environmental sites to have them ready for a productive reuse. Now, I know that this maze of money is daunting, in particular in our current environment. There's uncertainty, frankly, around what monies may be available. So there are a few resources that I'm going to share at the end of this presentation that I hope provide you some insights around available dollars and programmatic pieces that you may be able to tap into via the federal government. Now, I want to remind folks that the time, energy, and resources that you dedicate to composing this EPA application, whether it is for assessment or cleanup, has value. Even if it is not funded, it has value. It serves multiple purposes. It can help you sort of have the framework for additional grant applications. It can help you think about future planning efforts. So think about this as really as a multi-purpose process beyond just applying for these dollars. That you do not have to do this alone. In fact, there are a number of environmental consultants who will do this for you. You can also reach out to your EPA project officer, the state staff, or myself to seek support. Now, one sort of component here, in particular, as we mentioned, environmental consultants, that the rules have recently been updated around procurement and the competitive bid process. So make sure you follow those rules specifically and know that we are most likely going to face increased audits under the bipartisan infrastructure funding simply as a function of oversight. If you have questions, you need to ask those questions to your EPA officers prior to that solicitation going out in September, because once that solicitation is out, they will not respond to you to prevent any sort of impact on competitiveness for those applicants. Now, the original scoring, the threshold criteria scoring, again, takes place within our EPA office, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia. That's Region 4. After that threshold criteria has been met and your proposal can be scored, that evaluation panel really represents EPA regions across the country, and there is no involvement from myself or staff at the State Brownfield office other than providing you a letter of support for that application. Now, I would say here that our redevelopment process is simply more than just waiting for redevelopers to come in or outside investors to come in and do the work for us. We have to be revitalization ready. We have to have a revitalization plan, a reuse strategy that ties these sites to community needs. And I would invite you to break that big project down into components or smaller pieces with incremental progress towards that ultimate goal. And for each of those incremental pieces, I would invite you to create cost estimates so that you know when you start to identify outside funding sources, what you're looking for along the way. Now, as you work towards progress, you are also encouraged to celebrate those successes. however small or large. It will help you build momentum along the way and build sort of support. Now, one thing to note here is that, in particular with brownfield redevelopment assessment, it is hard for your community to physically observe the progress that you're making in the landscape. There may not be much that is changing on those sites as you assess. Now, as you get into cleanup, there may be more to observe in terms of construction equipment or actual cleanup activities. But this is your reminder that be cognizant of how you communicate your progress towards assessment and keep your community involved along the way. Now, consultants can be hired to support this resource road mapping that we've mentioned a number of times. Again, you can find all of the eligible activities. I had a few slides earlier in this presentation that sort of teased out some of those. You can find those on the EPA Brownfield website. And the goal really with all of these funding is that these properties don't just sit after they're assessed, is that we really do move them through a cleanup and redevelopment process along the way. Additionally, it is sort of a best practice to have a small fund set aside either as matching dollars or to invest in smaller projects as a part of that larger vision. But if you do not have access to those dollars, please know that you can explore and try to utilize Kentucky's grant program, the GRANT program, that provides matching funds for municipalities across the Commonwealth. Now, as we sort of wrap up here and move into the last few slides, I just want to remind you not to waste a good opportunity or an emergency. We know these are rallying points. These are opportunities where we can bring the community together. These are times when people are very interested in what the solutions are to the issues created, in particular by natural disasters. They often require redevelopment opportunities, whether we're talking about the floods in Eastern Kentucky or the tornadoes in Western Kentucky over the last few years. These are great opportunities to bring your community together, to think about both community needs and the future. The other thing to note here is that these federal programs do change names. For example, transportation grants have changed names a number of times. We've gone from Tiger to Build to Raise and now back to Build. Also know that if part of your revitalization goal is to increase tax bases, know that you will probably not see a growing tax base after year one of redevelopment. So make sure that you plan for patience in terms of your reporting outcomes and the way that you will investigate whether or not you are reaching those metrics that you've set forth in your application. And as we think about outside investment and encouraging other entities to invest in these properties, either privately or through granting dollars, think about your priority matrix or creating briefing sheets, elevator pitches to convey and effectively communicate your goals and objectives to these funding agencies. Now, as we think about funding and dollars and the redevelopment process, we know that overall project costs are large and daunting for many local communities. This is why it is critically important and also why you are required to articulate your resource strategy and how you are going to leverage additional resources or stack capital to achieve your redevelopment goals. Okay. This is particularly true for small and under-resourced or distressed communities throughout the Commonwealth, because in these areas we often see weak markets where outside commercial or outside investment are slow to trickle in particular in economically disadvantaged places. So know that if this describes your community or service area, it is even more critical for you to think about how you are going to stack capital and leverage additional resources. Now, I mentioned that I'm going to share a couple resources here. Every 2 years, coinciding with the National Brownfield Conference, the EPA publishes the Brownfields Federal Program Guide. We anticipate that guide will be published this year, as later this year, around August, typically, when the National Brownfield Conference is held. This year it is going to be held in Chicago. Now, this document is pretty unique because not only is it great for folks who are interested in brownfield redevelopment, but I would encourage you to explore this document anyway, because what it does is it outlines the available technical assistance and granting dollars that are available really for nearly every federal agency and individual departments within those agencies. It also provides a great summary of federal tax incentives and credits. So you see this laundry list of sort of federal agencies and departments, and this great list of some really substantial federal tax incentives and credits. Now, the document really is structured this way. It provides not only a text and narrative-based sort of description of all of these, but it provides them in a really user-friendly grid that lists the federal agencies on the left-hand sides, provides bulleted summaries of both technical and financial assistance. So again, if you are interested in applying for federal dollars, whether it be brownfields or otherwise, I would please invite you to check out this document to explore the matrix of funding available at the federal level. Again, this is simply another example of some screenshots from those pages from the Brownfield Bulletin that describe both the financial and technical assistance available through these federal agencies. With that said, we are concluding today's webinar. I hope that the information shared today has helped you better understand both the scoring rubric and the components associated with the upcoming or anticipated EPA Brownfield grants. I hope you have a better understanding of the type of EPA grants and the types of activities allowable with those grants. And lastly, I hope you have at least a preliminary understanding of the concepts of resource road mapping and leveraging additional capital in the places within the federal government and particular resources that you may be able to review as you explore these additional funding sources. With that said, I want to open it up for any questions or comments. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A function. You should see that as a part of your interface on your side of the Zoom webinar here. But I am going to stop my screen share and provide us some time for any Q&A. We've got a couple minutes here till the top of the hour. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to add those in the Q&A, and I will give us just a couple minutes to allow any comments to come in. Without further ado, I'll give just another minute here. It's kind of like an auction, you know, going once, going twice, seeing none. Again, this webinar has been recorded, and we will make that available to you if you would like to review, rewatch, or share with any of your stakeholders or constituents. And I will be sending out notifications for upcoming webinars and our grant writing training that will touch on some of these pieces, but provide some more hands-on training. So we do have one question that has came in. Is an individual or organizational eligible for purchasing brownfield properties if they are applying for grants? That's a great question. There is as a part of the brownfield granting process, ownership matters. In assessments, ownership matters because the owner is required to provide access to the property. So as a part of the assessment, whether you are doing it through a technical assistance of brownfield application for the property, or if it is part of the EPA assessment grant, that property owner does have to provide access to the property for it to be assessed. Now, if an individual or organization is purchasing a brownfield property, it depends on, if it depends on the eligibility, if you can get that grant. But what I would say is that if it is a singular property, I would encourage you to assess. Even if you are a nonprofit entity, do not, I repeat, do not accept any property without at least an environmental phase 1 assessment. Because if you do, you will be accepting all, and I mean all, environmental liability associated with prior use. Now, there are some caveats. In particular, if a local municipality acquired that property through eminent domain, legal action, tax delinquency, those sorts of things through sort of an approved process, or if the locality municipality owned that property prior to CERCLA, which I believe was 2020, or excuse me, 2001. There's a specific date in January. So um, there are some details around individuals and organizations. I should say that individuals are not eligible for brownfield grants. So if you own a property as an individual, you are not eligible for these grants. The only eligible entities are nonprofits, governments, local governments and municipalities, quasi-governmental institutions like area development districts. So if I own a building that is a personal property, I cannot apply for a brownfield grant to remediate the property, because technically, as the individual property owner, I should have done my due diligence in the same way that a due diligence is done on a home purchase. All home buyers, and in particular mortgage providers, require an inspection, and I would invite you to think about the brownfield assessment as your due diligence for a property. But unfortunately, individuals are not eligible for these grants, only organizations. Now, in terms of the timing, there is the requirement for a bona fide purchaser, and that is, there are some sort of technicalities that I would prefer to defer to the state staff to articulate, because they are way more familiar with sort of the regulations and regulatory environment around the transfer of properties. So Jody, I hope that responded to your question in a way that makes a little bit more sense. There are what we like to say, a lot of ways to get to yes. And in some cases, we can work with communities to think about creative ways to approach ownership and the transfer of property. But it's really on a case-by-case basis if they fall with sort of out of the purview of how we traditionally sort of execute and conceive assessments and cleanup. So again, individuals are not eligible, organizations are, nonprofits, local municipalities, quasi-governmental institutions, owners do have to be a part of the process to provide access to the assessment, and the applicant does have to own that property to perform the cleanup on it. So I know it is probably more complicated than maybe what it should be. But if you have additional questions, please follow up, and either myself or the state staff can help you navigate that. So I hope that's helped you address that question, or I have addressed that question effectively for you. But sort of one last piece here, do not accept any property, please, without doing an assessment, because you will be accepting that liability with it. I'm going to give just another moment or two for questions. So I'm glad to hear that addressed. Jody, if you have any more questions about that, please reach out. Easiest way to reach me is my email, shane.barton@uky.edu. Okay, we have reached 2 o'clock. Actually 2:01. So I'm going to, unfortunately, I may have lied. I'm not giving you back any extra time. I actually took one minute of your time. I apologize for that. Again, thank you all so much for attending and spending this hour with us. We are going to adjourn, but if there are any questions that you would like to explore, please send us an email, and I will either respond or direct that to the state staff if they are more appropriate. With that said, have a great day, and thank you all for joining us. Take care.